We're in the studio of Joseph Anthony McDonnell, sculptor. We'll be talking with Joe about his life's work and his journey from the figurative to the abstract, still breaking away.
My name is Joe McDonnell. I'm a sculptor, and I've been a sculptor all of my mature life. I was born and raised in Detroit, which in the 50s was really quite a pleasant place to grow up. I did go to commercial art school for about a year at night, and while there I began doing figure studies, and I learned how to render and do all of the typical things you learn in a rather commercial sense. However, that really did not appeal to me much as a career. So I transferred to Notre Dame. Being from an Irish Catholic family, Notre Dame seemed the best place one could happen to go. I was very lucky to get in. One of the things that greatly impressed me were the murals of Diego Rivera, which later came into my life by the fact that I studied with a man who had taught Rivera how to paint fresco. I went down to Mexico to look at some of the murals, and it was in Mexico that I became familiar with pre-Columbian sculpture. I couldn't believe the kind of aesthetic experience that these works of art had on me. And when I got back to school, I was at the University of Notre Dame, I decided I want to become a sculptor. This is a photograph, the back cover of a book on the man that was probably the most influential to me. He was my teacher in the university, Ivan Mestrovic, who was a Yugoslav. The cover of the book shows one of his large female sculptures carved in marble. He was more or less one of the last of the great traditionalists. He would carve directly in stone, much as Michelangelo did. He had worked with Rodin and assisted Rodin when he was a young man. And he was a sculptor who spent the war years in the Vatican and came to this country, and was the first living artist to have a one-person show at the Metropolitan Museum. Notre Dame got him about 1950, came to the school, and had only 4 students, which were all graduate students. And by hook and by crook, and the good graces of the president of Notre Dame, Father Hesburgh, I became one of Mestrovic's assistants and stayed on with him through 2 degrees. Right. And that gave me a great deal of both knowledge on how to do sculpture in a very traditional way, but also the courage to build large pieces. He was nearing the end of his life, and he was very concerned about what would happen to his work, and it made me realize the seriousness of going into this profession, that it wasn't merely a way of hopefully making a living. This sculpture was one of my earliest pieces. It was created in 1968 while I was living in Italy. The sculpture is a standing woman, a woman in the wind, in which her leg or legs go into one shape, and the wraparound skirt goes off into forms. The forms are very cubistic and almost Art Deco in approach. The back of the sculpture this way has a very negative shape and is almost scooped out as if with an ice cream scoop. This was much inspired by seeing some of the sculptures in cathedrals and on walls, in which for lightness sake the backs of the stones were carved away. The head of the sculpture is very simplified and was created from a more or less an egg shape and carved with tools rather than modeled with clay. The hair was applied in kind of a free-flowing shape and then reworked with sandpaper and screening. It has very both African and, I would say almost Brancusi feel to it. And I call it Woman in the Wind. And it is a piece that I have since enlarged. I've sculpted the piece at a height of 6.5 feet, and it's at a private estate down in Vero Beach, Florida. It's one of my favorite pieces, and it's kind of, I think it was greatly influenced by seeing and getting to know the Italian futurists. This figure here, which is, I call a attentive figure, a figure watching, is a follow-through on a piece that I did in 1968, which I call Bather. And this is a model. It's never been realized at a full scale. And it would complement the Bather. What I tried to do here was to utilize the kind of the form created by the body and the legs, which is a negative space, almost like a ball. And then I cut into that negative space interesting shapes like this triangular form here, this triangular form here, and this more elliptical shape here. I used the technique which I had in The Woman in the Wind of scooping out the back to form a negative space to contrast with the more positive, strong forms. This is Homage to the Sun, which has the arms going up, and Homage to the Rain, there's a basin to hold water in the lap. I wanted them to feel very classical and yet to look very earthbound. They almost look like mud that's been slightly sculptured or handled to form these shapes. They're not to be too definite. My evolution into abstraction was almost like I felt I had to do it because I felt I had to grow up. I felt that my figurative work and what I'd been doing to that point was a formative process. And now I had to begin taking different steps. And when I began studying David Smith's work, I realized he was using the same principles of constructivism that was done by the early painters, Russian painters, especially in the century, and then also by using the same forms that I found very appealing in the Mexican and pre-Columbian works, using blocks to construct with. And I did not find it as difficult as I thought. This is a little piece that I created directly out of wax. And this one I call Sentinel because it looks somewhat like a symbol of a train, either a train semaphore or somebody just standing with their arms up trying to send signals. Well, I think the ambiguity is there because I'm not trying to say it 100%. I'm trying to say it in such a way that it's interesting to me, and I hope will be interested to my audience, to whoever sees my work. I think an artist works for an audience, regardless what you make. I mean, if you make things for yourself and nobody sees them, I feel they're empty. It's your light under a barrel. I think the initial process is you're trying to make something interesting. And you're trying to make something that is, as much as you can, your own. I mean, art feeds on art, so we're all influenced by whatever we see and live by. Pick and choose, and we come up with things that are our own, and then they evolve to the point that they are your own. I think how it happens is really part of the mystery of how art is made. This is the original model, or maquette, as the term is used, for a set of gates, which are to go on a large private estate over in Medina. And it's for the home, the big home that's being built by the collectors, John and Mary Shirley. And they have approved this, and we'll be starting on this project soon. Probably will be installed the middle of the summer. Usually I start with a small sketch when I have an idea, very, very loose, not very well developed sketch on paper. And then I'll usually go to a model, some kind of a model, and this can be made out of all kinds of materials. It could be made out of little pieces of wood, it could be made out of clay, it could be made out of plaster, might be made out of steel, but usually the scale is quite small, usually under 8 inches or 10 inches. And then after I've done that, I look at the piece and I say, now if I did this to it and that to it and that to it, then I'll go to a second stage that's usually about twice that size. And then I'll again enlarge it till it's about 3 times that size. And then at that point, I really begin making major changes and deciding whether I want to develop the theme any further, or sometimes I'll abandon it, sometimes I'll set it aside. Well, I think all of my pieces, almost everything I do, I design with the idea that hopefully one day they'll be large. To be a sculptor, I feel you almost have to have assistance, because the physical demands of building a large piece are such that it's just very, very hard, especially when you get older. One just doesn't have the strength to build things as one did when one were younger. On the smaller work, you really can't have people very involved, because it's a matter of making little judgments and little changes. And only when you transfer a small model to a next size can you have assistants do it. And I rely a lot on that, because it allows me time to start something else. The actual pleasure of producing a piece comes from seeing the piece done. I don't get the thrill that I used to from grinding and polishing and doing all that stuff I spend 60, 70 hours a week doing. This is an award that I've been commissioned to create for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There were 5 artists who were invited to partake in this competition, and I was fortunate in being the one who was finally selected. I had a bit of a problem trying to come up with the right idea, and I recalled some of the work I had done about 10 years ago, in which I was using a disc, and this disc I was cutting lines into. And I began thinking about it and thinking what a great idea this might be for this award. It will eventually be made in bronze and gold plated. And then the sculpture, when finished, will be set on a base similar to this, with the point being up here, radiating the 2 directions that the foundation is mostly interested in, world health and education. And this corner up here is, as it were, the northwest corner of the sculpture. And the disc represents the globe, and it returns around and returns to the point of origin. Well, most of my commissions, and I certainly prefer it this way, is someone has seen my work and they see a small model or a small sculpture, and they view it large, as I always hoped it would be large. So it was merely a question of deciding how large and what material and what the budget was. I have designed pieces for specific sites, but it's usually a lot more difficult, because everyone has their own aesthetic, and if you make something of one dimension, the commissioning agent might say, oh, well, I like this, except I wish you'd do a little bit different. And sometimes it's very hard to please someone. Much better if they see something, they say, that's it, and we go from there. I worked for some of the major developers. I did 10 projects for Trammell Crow. I did 6 for General Electric. I did, I think, 6 for IBM. I don't know, it's just something that happened very early in my career, when I was directed to an architect who was doing a large project in Chicago. And he suggested I talk to the developer. I talked to him, and he liked my work, and he bought a piece or 2 and commissioned me to do a sculpture. And then he kindly referred me to some other developers. And since then, it has kind of gone that way. I mean, I became aware that architects and developers and sometimes competitions were the way to go, and I've always worked in those directions. Well, the piece at Pike Place Market was commissioned by Bob Thurston, whom I happen to know. And we were talking one day, and I said, you know, you ought to stop by my studio. I said, I have an interesting piece of sculpture that might look nice in that little fountain of yours. And he kind of mumbled, oh yeah, what's it look like? Well, my windows were frosted, and I drew it in the frost on the window of the car. He said, that does look interesting. I think I'll stop by. Well, he stopped by and purchased the piece. So, I mean, you never know when it'll happen. Well, it just happens to have worked that way with me. I think every artist has to find their own route. Certainly Picasso has never been a very social type of artist. He never went out and hustled work and went to openings and things, but he was, through his dealer and such, he was always able to sell his work from very early in his career. Most artists would like that to work for them too, and I would too, but it's very difficult to place your life and your career in one dealer's hands and sit back and hope it happens. These reliefs were created as wall pieces with the idea that hopefully they would find a home. And I have done quite a few commissions with wall pieces. And these various designs have evolved over, probably over 15 years. Lately I've done a few, enlarged a few. We're doing one for an office building here in the city. I got so excited by doing that I did 3 more large ones. And what's nice is that I think they give a lot more vitality to a wall than a mere painting. They're 3-dimensional paintings. They're not reliefs in the sense that they're depending on shadow and line as much as on color and the fact that light will bounce off them. Well, the idea of breaking away comes from a certain time in my life when I had to change habits and change a lot of things in my life. Well, about 20 years ago, 21 years ago exactly, I kind of reached the height of a drinking problem I had. And I got in a lot of trouble, which was bound to happen. As part of my getting out of this, I stopped drinking. And I haven't had a drink in 21 years. Went to therapy, and I more or less rebuilt my life. And my artwork did a 90-degree. It just became so much better, I feel. And I realigned my relationship with my children, and my marriage eventually, a couple of years later, dissolved. So I was breaking away from bad habits and a way of living. And I saw a picture frame that was broken and yet still together, and there were things coming out of it. And I said to myself, this is kind of what you're doing with your life. You have the same structure, and yet you're changing it. You're breaking away from the old into the new. It was the same time that I had started to do this design, so it was very appropriate. And since then, I like it very much that I've just continued to use the same basic concept of a frame with things breaking out of it in many different ways. And that series culminates in the large piece I did for the University of Washington campus last fall. So I feel that the idea of breaking away, it's more interesting when they know my story, but I don't think it's necessarily an overriding point one has to know to appreciate the work. I think every Every work of art any artist or creative person makes, whether it's a writer or filmmaker or musician or artist, proclaims the identity of the artist. It's a way of saying, John Smith made me, Joe McDonnell made me. It's an extension of oneself. And I think it's, you know, when you sell a work, it doesn't matter. You still own the work. It's still part of yourself, whether somebody physically owns it or not. It's still you and it's still yours. They actually are sharing with you your aesthetic or your statement. So I always feel it's very good. My wife's always saying, why did you sell your best work? And I said, well, first of all, the best work is it's the best to other people too, and that's why they want it more than another piece. And then secondly, I'm just delighted to have the best work in somebody else's collection. The only other things I've done in my life, really I've been a sculptor full-time through all my life and made my living at it, is that I did have a brief stint part-time teaching for about a year, and I found it very disruptive to my creative process. I was critic for Art World, which was a very well-respected art newspaper, monthly newspaper, came out in New York City, and every month I reviewed a major sculpture show or shows, and it was it was an exciting thing to do. Criticism that I wanted published would only be positive. I didn't feel it was a good idea to go around and, because you didn't like somebody's work or whatever, try tearing them down. I felt there's enough good work and good artists out there, and give them the break of the printed word. There was only one choice, major choice, that I wonder about, and that was for going on to graduate school. I went to Yale to talk to Joseph Albers, and Albers liked my work a lot, and it was all figurative work, and Albers, of course, was doing very abstract Bauhaus type pieces that he himself was part of the Bauhaus. And he offered me a full scholarship to go to Yale. And, but he did say to me, Joe, he said, your work has a lot of poetry. I take poetry out of art. And that rather upset me. And I went to see what they were doing in sculpture, and there was a very good sculptor by the name of Bob Engman doing abstract pieces that he said were based on nature forms. And it was something that I think I got to about 15 years later. But based on the fact that it wasn't figurative work, and on what Albert said, I declined his invitation to go to Yale. And at that time, Yale turned out to be the real hotbed of contemporary art. Chuck Close was there, and Nancy Graves, Sarah was there. Klaus Oldenburg was there. The whole bunch of contemporary artists, it seems, came out of there at that time. And who knows, maybe I would have been one of those guys. I don't know. You know, but I went to Italy instead, and I spent the best years of my life in Italy. So I don't know that I made the wrong call. You know, and for the fact that you make it yourself, well, that's kind of, I forget who it was that said it, but that one's own, the last vestige of paradise is one's own labors. And certainly when you're a sculptor making things, you have your own fruit of your own labor right there before you, where in some other things it's much harder to put into focus and say this is yours. And I think in today's world where so many jobs you don't really see what you're doing or the result of your work, I feel very, very fortunate that I can look back and point to so many things that I made, and they're mine, and it's me.
I want to thank you, Joseph Anthony McDonnell, sculptor, for taking the time out of your work to chat with us.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and thank you very much.